leave alone. We took Graf Norden's body out into the November night, under the stars that burned with a brightness terrible to behold, and drove madly, wildly up the mountain road, leave alone. The body had to be destroyed because of the eyes that would not close, but seemed to be staring at some object behind the observer, leave alone. The body that was entirely drained of blood without the slightest trace of a wound, the body whose flesh was covered with abhorrent, luminous markings, designs that shifted and changed form before one's eyes, leave alone. We wedged what had been Graf Norden tightly behind the wheel, put a makeshift fuse in the gas tank, lit it, then shoved the car over the side of the road, where it plummeted down to the main highway, a flaming meteor. Not until the next day did we realize that we had all been under Doreen's spell. Even I had forgotten. How else could we have rushed out so eagerly? The air was too still, leaving him to gloat over his triumph. From that terrible moment when the lights came on again, and we saw the thing that had, a moment before, been Graf Norden, we were as shadowy, indistinct figures rushing through a dream, was forgotten save the unspoken commands upon us as we watched the blazing car strike the pavement below, observed its demolition, then tramped dully each to his own home. When, the next day, partial memory returned to us and we sought Doreen, he was gone. And, because we valued our freedom, we did not tell anyone what had happened, nor try to discover whence Doreen had vanished. We wanted only to forget, leave alone. I think I might possibly have forgotten had I not looked into the Song of West again. With the others, there has been a growing tendency to treat it all as illusion, but I cannot leave alone. I have learned a small part of reality, for it is one thing to read of books like the Necronomicon, Book of Iban, or Song of Yost, leave alone. But it is quite different when one's own experience confirms some of the dread things related therein, leave alone. Many have read excerpts from the Necronomicon, yet are reassured by the thought that Alhazard was mad. What if they were to discover that, far from being mad, leave alone? Abdul Alhazard was so terribly sane that others dubbed him mad simply because they could not bear the burden of the facts he uncovered. Of such truths, I found one paragraph in the Song of Yest, and have not read farther. The dark volume, along with Norden's other books, is still on my shelves. I have not burned it. But I do not think that I shall read more. But let me tell you of Doreen and Graf Norden, for around these two lie the reasons for my reluctance for the further pursuance of my studies. I met Graf Norden at Darwich University in Dr. Held's class in medieval and early Renaissance history, which was more a study of obscure thought and often outright occultism. Leave alone. Norden was greatly interested. He had done quite a bit of exploring into the occult. In particular was he fascinated by the writings and records of a family of adepts named Durka, who traced their ancestry back to the pre-glacial days. Leave alone. The Durkas, had translated the Song of Yost from its legendary form into the three great languages of the Dawn cultures, then into the Greek, Latin, Arabic, and finally, Elizabethan English. Poseidon. I told Norden I deplored the blind contempt in which the world holds the occult, but had never explored the subject very deeply. I was content to be a spectator, letting my imagination drift at will upon the many currents in this dark river. Skimming over the surface was enough for me. Seldom did I take occasional plunges into the deeps. Still, as a poet and dreamer, I was careful not to lose myself in the blackness of the pools where I disported. One could always emerge to find a calm, blue sky, and a world that thought nothing of these realities. Leave alone. With Norden, it was different. He was already beginning to have doubts, he told me. It was not an easy road to travel, There were hideous dangers hidden all along the way. Leave alone. Often so that the wayfarer was not aware of them until too late. Leave alone. Earthmen were not very far along the path of evolution, still very young. Their lack of knowledge, as a race, told heavily against such few of their number who sought to traverse unknown roads. Leave alone. He spoke of messengers from beyond and made references to obscure passages in the Necronomicon and Song of Wasti. Alone he spoke of alien beings, entities terribly unhuman, impossible of measurement by any human yardstick, or to be combated effectively by mankind. Doreen came into the picture at about this time. He walked into the classroom one day during the course of a lecture. Later, Dr. Held introduced him as a new member of the class, coming from abroad. There was something about Doreen that challenged my interest at once. I could not determine of what race or nationality he might be. He was very close to being beautiful, his every movement being of grace and rhythm. Yet, in no way could he be considered effeminate. He was, in a word, superb. That the majority of us avoided him troubled him not at all. For my part, he did not seem genuine, but with the others, it was probably his utter lack of emotion. There was, for example, leave alone, the time in the lab when a test tube burst in his face, driving several splinters deep into the skin. Leave alone. He showed not the slightest sign of discomfort, waved aside all expressions of solicitude on the part of some of the girls, leave alone, and proceeded to go on with his experiment as soon as the medico had finished with him. The final act started when we were dealing with hypnotism one afternoon, and were discussing the practical possibilities of the subject. Following up the Rhine experiments and others, Colby presented a most ingenious argument against it, ridiculed the association of experiments in thought transference or telepathy with hypnotism, Sten, and arrived at a final conclusion that hypnotism's eye outside of mechanical means of induction was impossible. It was at this point that Doreen spoke up. What he said, I cannot now recall, but it ended in a direct challenge for Doreen to prove his statements. Norden said nothing during the course of this debate. He appeared somewhat pale, and was, I noticed, trying to flash a warning signal to Colby. My frank opinion, now, is that Doreen had planned evoking this challenge. At the time, however, it seemed spontaneous enough. There were 5 of us over at Norden's place that night. Granville, Chalmers, Colby, Norden, and myself. Norden was smoking endless cigarettes, Glaone, knowing his nails and muttering to himself. I suspected something irregular was up, but what, I had no idea. Then Doreen came in the conversation, such as it had been ended. Repeated his challenge, saying he had brought along the others as witnesses to ensure against being tricked by stage devices. No mirrors, lights, or any other mechanical means of inducing hypnosis would be permitted. It must be entirely a matter of wills. Doreen nodded, drew the shade, then turned, directing his gaze at Colby. We watched, expecting him to make motions with his hands and pronounce commands. He did neither. He fixed his eyes upon Colby, and the latter stiffened as if struck by lightning. Then, eyes staring blankly ahead of him, he rose slowly, standing on the narrow strip of black that ran diagonally down through the center of the rug. Too still. My mind ran back to the day I caught Norden in the act of destroying some papers and apparatus, the latter which had been constructed, too still, with such assistance as I had been able to give over a period of several months. His eyes were terrible, and I could see doubt in them. Not long after this event, Doreen had made his appearance. Could there have been a connection? I wondered. My reverie was broken abruptly by the sound of Doreen's voice commanding Colby to speak, telling us where he was and what he saw around him. When Colby obeyed, it was as if his voice came to us from a distance. "Leave alone." He was standing, he said, on a narrow bridgeway overlooking a frightful abyss, so vast and deep that he could discern neither floor nor boundary. "Leave alone." Behind him, this bridgeway stretched until it was lost in a bluish haze. Ahead, it ran toward what appeared to be a plateau. "Leave alone." He hesitated to move because of the narrowness of the path, yet realized that he must make for the plateau before the very sight of the depths below him made him lose his balance. He felt strangely heavy. Alone and speaking was an effort. Colby's voice ceased. We all gazed in fascination at the little strip of black in the blue rug. This, then, was the bridge over the abyss. But what could correspond to the illusion of depth? Why did his voice seem so far away? Why did he feel heavy? The plateau must be the workbench at the other end of the room. The rug ran up to a sort of dais upon which was set Norden's table. The surface of this being some 7 feet above the floor. Colby now began to walk slowly down the black swath, moving as if with extreme caution, looking like a slow-motion camera shot. His limbs appeared weighted. He was breathing rapidly. Doreen now bade him halt and look down into the abyss carefully, telling us what he saw there. At this, we again examined the rug, as if we had never seen it before and did not know that it was entirely without decoration save for that single black strip upon which Colby now stood. His voice came to us again. He said, at first, that he saw nothing in the abyss below him. Then he gasped, swayed, and almost lost his balance. We could see the sweat standing out on his brow and neck, soaking his blue shirt. There were things in the abyss, he said in hoarse tones. Great shapes that were like blobs of utter blackness, yet which he knew to be alive. From the central masses of their beings, he could see them shoot forth incredibly long, filamentine tentacles. They moved themselves forward and backward, horizontally, but could not move vertically, it seemed. They were, he thought, nothing but living shadows. But the things were not all on the same plane. True, their movements were only horizontal in relation to their position, but some were parallel to him and some diagonal. Far away, he could see things perpendicular to him. There appeared now to be a great deal more of the things than he had thought. The first ones he had seen were far below, unaware of his presence. But these sensed him, and were trying to reach him. He was moving faster now, he said, but to us he was still walking in slow motion. I glanced sidewise at Norden. He, too, was sweating profusely. He arose now and went over to Doreen, speaking in low tones so that none of us could hear. I knew that he was referring to Colby and that Doreen was refusing whatever it was Norden demanded. Then Doreen was forgotten momentarily as Colby's voice came to us again, quivering with fright. The things were reaching out for him. They rose and fell on all sides, some far away, some hideously close. None had found the exact plane upon which he could be captured. The darting tentacles had not touched him, but all of the beings now sensed his presence, he was sure, and he feared that perhaps they could alter their planes at will, though it appeared that they must do so blindly, seemingly like two-dimensional beings. The tentacles darting at him were threads of utter darkness. "Leave alone." A terrible suspicion arose in me, as I recalled some of the earlier conversations with Norden and remembered certain passages from the Song of Yasti. I tried to rise, but my limbs were powerless. "Leave alone." I could only sit helplessly and watch. Norden was still speaking with Doreen, and I saw that he was now very pale. "Leave alone." He seemed to shrink away. Then he turned and went over to a cabinet, took out some object, and came to the strip of rug upon which Colby was standing. "Leave alone." Norden nodded to Doreen, and now I saw what it was he held in his hand, a polyhedron of glassy appearance. There was in it, however, a glow that startled me. Alone, desperately I tried to remember the significance of it, for I knew. But my thoughts were being short-circuited, it seemed, and, when Doreen's eyes rested upon me, the very room seemed to stagger. Again Colby's voice came through, this time despairingly. He was afraid he would never reach the plateau. So actually, he was about 1.5 yards away from the end of the black strip and the dais upon which stood Norden's workbench. The things, said Colby, were close now, a mass of thread, like tentacles had just missed him. Now Norden's voice came to us. It too, seemingly far away, he called my name. This was more, he said, than mere hypnotism. It was. But then his voice faded, and I felt the power of Doreen blanking out the sound of his words. Now and then, I would hear a sentence or a few disjointed words. But, from this I managed to get an inkling of what was going on. Leave alone. This was not mere hypnotism, but actually trans-dimensional journeying. We just imagined we saw Norden and Colby standing on the rug, or perhaps it was through Doreen's influence. Leave alone. The nameless dimension was the habitat of these shadow beings. The abyss and the bridge upon which the two stood were illusions created by Doreen. When that which Doreen had planned was complete, leave alone, our minds would be probed, and our memories treated so that we recalled no more than Doreen wished us to remember. He, Doreen, was a being of incredible power, leave alone, who was using Colby and the rest of us for a nameless purpose, leave alone. Norden had succeeded in forcing an agreement upon Doreen, one which he would have to keep as a result. If the two could reach the plateau before the shadow beings touched them, all would be well, leave alone. If not, Norden did not specify, but indicated that they were being hunted as men hunt game. The polyhedron contained an element repulsive to the things. He was but a little behind Colby. We could see him aiming with the polyhedron. Colby spoke again, telling us that Norden had materialized behind him and had brought some sort of weapon with which the things could be held off. Then Norden called my name, asking me to take care of his belongings if he did not return, telling me to look up the Dumbrali in the Song of Yast. Slowly, Lai and Colby made their way toward the dais and the table. Colby was but a few steps ahead of Norden. Now he climbed upon the dais and, with the other's help, made his way onto the bench. He tried to assist Norden, but, as the latter mounted the dais, he stiffened suddenly and the polyhedron fell from his hands. Frantically, he tried to draw himself up, but he was being forced backward and I knew that he had lost. Ew. Thing. There came to us a single cry of anguish, then the lights in the room faded and went out. Whatever spell had been upon us now was removed. We rushed about like madmen, trying to find Norden, Colby, and the light switch. Then, thing. Suddenly, the lights were on again, and we saw Colby sitting dazedly on the bench, while Norden lay on the floor. Thing. Chalmers bent over the body in an effort to resuscitate him, but when he saw the condition of Norden's remains, he became so hysterical that we had to knock him cold in order to quiet him. Colby followed us mechanically, apparently unaware of what was happening. We took Graf Norden's body out into the November night and destroyed it by fire, telling Colby later that he had apparently suffered a heart attack while driving up the mountain road. The car had gone over and his body was almost completely destroyed in the Holocaust. Later Chalmers, Granville, and I met in an effort to rationalize what we had seen and heard. Chalmers had been all right after he came around, had helped us with our grisly errand up the mountain road. Neither, I found, had heard Norden's voice after he had joined Colby in the supposed hypnotic stage. So, it was as I thought. Doreen's power had blanked out the sound of Norden's voice for them completely. Nor did they recall seeing any object in Norden's hand. But in less than a week, even these memories had faded from them. They fully believed that Norden had died in an accident after an unsuccessful attempt on the part of Doreen to hypnotize Colby. Prior to this, their explanation had been that Doreen had killed Norden for reasons unknown, and that we had been his unwitting accomplices. Still, the hypnotic experiment had been a blind to gather us all together and provide a means of disposing of the body. That Doreen had been able to hypnotize us, they did not doubt then. The illusion of the abyss, they said, was just a cruel joke. Leave alone. It is no use telling them what I learned a few days later, what I learned from Norden's notes which explained Doreen's arrival, or to quote sections from the Song of Yast to them. Yet leave alone. I must set these things down. In that accursed book is a section dealing with an utterly alien race of entities known as the Adumbrali. Leave alone. Oh, and these be none other than the Adumbrali, the living shadows, beings of incredible power and malignancy, which dwell without the veils of space and time such as we know it. Leave alone. Their sport it is to import into their realm the inhabitants of other dimensions, upon whom they practice horrid pranks and manifold illusions. Bah, leave alone. But more dreadful than these are the seekers which they send out into other worlds and dimensions, beings of incredible power which they themselves have created, and leave alone. Guised in the form of those who dwell within whatever dimension, or upon whichever worlds where these seekers be sent. Bah, leave alone. These seekers can be detected only by the adept, to whose trained eyes their perfectness of form and movement, their strangeness and aura of alienage and power is a sure sign. The sage Joconine tells of one of these seekers who deluded 7 priests of Nyakagwa into challenging it to a duel of the hypnotic arts. He further tells how 2 of these were trapped and delivered to the Adumbrali, their bodies being returned when the shadow things had done with them. Alone. Most curious of all was the condition of the corpses, being entirely drained of all fluid, yet showing no trace of a wound, even the most slight. But the crowning horror was the eyes, leave alone, which could not be closed, appearing to stare restlessly outward, beyond the observer, and the strangely luminous markings on the dead flesh, leave alone. Curious designs which appeared to move and change form before the eyes of the beholder, leave alone.
The portrait arrived at my shop on a rainy afternoon in October 1923, wrapped in black cloth and carried by a man who refused to tell me where he had found it. I was 37 then, the proprietor of a modest antiquarian bookshop in Bloomsbury, London. Paintings were not my business, but the stranger seemed remarkably determined that I should have this particular one. He placed it against my counter and said, "Keep it somewhere people can see it." When I asked what price he wanted, he smiled without humor. "You couldn't afford what it costs." Then he walked into the rain and disappeared. I should have left the cloth exactly where it was. Instead, curiosity won. Beneath it was an oil portrait of a gentleman seated in a dark green armchair. He appeared to be about 40, elegantly dressed in the fashion of the late 18th century. His face was handsome but unpleasant, with narrow eyes and a small smile that suggested he knew something amusing about whoever happened to be looking at him. One hand rested on a silver-topped cane. The other held a pocket watch. A brass plate on the frame gave his name as Augustus Vail, 1764 to 1829. The artist's name had been carefully scratched away. I hung the portrait behind the counter. That evening, shortly before closing, an elderly customer named Mrs. Davenport stopped to admire it. She stared for several seconds before asking why I kept a portrait of a dead man in my shop. I pointed out that almost every portrait from the 18th century depicted somebody dead. She didn't smile. "No," she said. "I mean that man is dead." I looked again. Vail appeared perfectly normal. Mrs. Davenport stepped closer and suddenly gasped. His eyes moved. I assured her it was simply the effect of varnish catching the light. She left without purchasing anything. The following morning I noticed that Augustus Vail looked older, not dramatically. There were simply lines around his eyes that I did not remember seeing before. His hair seemed grayer at the temples. I blamed the changing daylight. 3 days later, however, there could be no mistake. Vail had aged perhaps 10 years. His cheeks had become hollow and his hands were thinner. Even stranger, the pocket watch he held had changed. When the portrait arrived, its hands showed 20 minutes past 3. They now showed 3:45. I removed the painting from the wall and examined it beneath a lamp. The paint was dry and ancient. Nothing had been altered. I began researching Augustus Vail. He had been a wealthy physician who lived near London during the Georgian period. Contemporary accounts described him as charming, educated, and unusually interested in the possibility of extending human life. His wife died mysteriously in 1801. 2 servants disappeared from his household during the following decade. Vale himself supposedly died in 1829 at the age of 65. There was, however, no record of his burial. More disturbing was a newspaper advertisement from 1837 offering a reward for the return of a stolen family portrait. The advertisement described the painting hanging behind my counter. That night I stayed late. I placed a chair opposite the portrait and watched. At midnight, the shop clock chimed. Vale's painted eyes moved towards me. There was no illusion this time. His pupils shifted slowly until he was looking directly into my face. The pocket watch advanced by 1 minute. I stood so quickly that my chair overturned. Vale smiled. Then something impossible happened. His painted chest rose beneath his waistcoat as he took a breath. A faint whisper came from the canvas. Closer, I backed towards the door. Vale's smile widened. "Please," he said, "I cannot see you properly from there." I covered the painting and left. The following morning, the black cloth lay neatly folded on the floor. Vale had aged another 20 years. He was now an elderly man, his skin sagging and spotted, his once dark hair almost white. Yet something else had changed. Behind him, painted into the shadowy background, stood a woman. She had not been there before. I recognized Mrs. Davenport. Her face was pale and frightened. She appeared to be pressing both hands against the inside of the canvas. I telephoned her home. Her daughter answered and told me Mrs. Davenport had died during the night. I immediately carried the portrait into the cellar and turned it towards the wall. For 2 days, nothing happened. On the 3rd morning, I found it hanging behind the counter again. I had locked the cellar myself. Vale was now impossibly old. His face had collapsed into deep folds, and one milky eye stared from beneath a drooping lid. Mrs. Davenport remained behind him. There were others now, a young maid, a bearded gentleman, a little old woman wearing mourning clothes. Their painted faces seemed to emerge from the darkness surrounding Vale's chair. On the table beside him stood a glass decanter that had not been there before. That afternoon a man entered the shop and asked whether I possessed a portrait of Augustus Vale. His name was Professor Henry Mercer, an art historian from Cambridge. When I showed him the painting, he became visibly frightened. Mercer had been searching for it for 14 years. He claimed the portrait had appeared repeatedly throughout the 19th century. Every owner reported the same phenomenon. Vale aged while people around the painting died. Then, when the figure reached extreme old age, something happened. What? I asked. Mercer looked towards the portrait. He becomes young again. I laughed nervously. Paintings do not become young. Mercer did not respond. He opened a leather folder containing photographs. One showed the portrait in 1872. Augustus Vale looked approximately 40. Another, taken 5 years later, showed him as an ancient man. A final photograph from 1878 showed Vale young again. Standing behind his chair were 11 additional figures. Mercer tapped them with one finger. All 11 died while the portrait was in that house. I looked towards my painting. Vale's remaining eye seemed fixed upon us. Mercer whispered, "I believe the portrait isn't aging." He is. That evening we decided to destroy it. We carried the painting into the courtyard behind my shop and soaked the canvas with paraffin. Mercer struck a match. Before he could drop it, a voice came from the portrait. "Henry." Mercer froze. Vale no longer looked old. He was watching us. "Henry," he repeated, "your mother has been waiting." Behind his chair, a woman appeared. Mercer made a choking sound. Mother, the painted woman lifted her hand. "Henry, darling." Mercer stepped forward. I grabbed him. He fought me with surprising strength, shouting that his mother was alive inside the painting. Then Vale began laughing. His face changed as we watched. The wrinkles disappeared. His back straightened. White hair darkened. Roll. The transformation happened within seconds. Augustus Vale became a young man of perhaps 25. At the same time, Professor Mercer screamed. His hair turned gray. His skin tightened against his skull. He aged decades before my eyes. I tried to hold him, but his body became impossibly light. His clothes collapsed around him. Within moments, I was holding the dried remains of an old man. In the portrait, Mercer appeared behind Vale's chair. He looked young again. His mother stood beside him. I dropped the match. Flames covered the canvas. Every figure inside the painting screamed. The sound did not come from the courtyard. It came from somewhere far away, as though dozens of people were trapped at the bottom of a deep well. Vale stood from his painted chair, his expression twisted with rage. For the first time, I saw what had been hidden behind him. The room in the portrait had no walls. Beyond the chair stretched an enormous darkness filled with faces, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. Vale reached towards me. His painted fingers pressed against the surface of the canvas, stretching it outward like skin. The fire suddenly went out. The painting remained untouched. Vale was standing now, very close to the painted surface. His youthful face filled almost the entire canvas. "You cannot burn time," he whispered. I understood then. Augustus Vale had found his immortality. The portrait aged instead of his body, but eventually it required another life to renew him. Every person it consumed gave him more years. He had not died in 1829. He had simply disappeared into his own painting. The portrait was not preserving his image. It was preserving him. I took the only action I could think of. I smashed the shop's large front window, carried the portrait outside, and dragged it into the street. Vale screamed at me to stop. I placed the painting face down beneath the wheels of a delivery lorry parked nearby. Then I woke the driver and told him somebody was stealing his vehicle. The frightened man started the engine and drove forward. The wooden frame shattered beneath the tires. I heard Vale scream once when I lifted the remains. The canvas had split from top to bottom. Behind the painted surface was another layer of canvas. Then another and another. I peeled them apart. Each contained a different portrait of Augustus Vale from a different century. Old, young again. Beneath the final layer was not canvas at all. It was human skin, dry and yellow with age. Written across it in brown ink were dozens of names. Mrs. Davenport, Professor Mercer, people stretching back more than 100 years. At the bottom was an empty space. I burned every piece separately. This time the fire took them. By dawn, nothing remained except ash. For the rest of my life, I never owned another portrait. I sold the shop in 1951 and retired to Sussex. I died in 1968. You may reasonably wonder how I can tell you anything beyond that point. The answer lies in something discovered last year during renovations to the old Bloomsbury building. Workers removed a wall behind what had once been my counter. Inside they found a narrow cavity containing a painting. It was a portrait of me. I was seated in a dark green armchair. One hand rested upon a silver-topped cane. The other held a pocket watch. Behind me stood Mrs. Davenport and Professor Mercer. The workers photographed the painting before placing it in storage. 3 days later, one of them noticed something strange about the photograph. I was smiling. According to the man who took it, I had not been smiling before. Yesterday, the painting disappeared from storage. Nobody knows who took it. But somewhere tonight, perhaps in an antique shop, a market stall, or hanging innocently on the wall of a newly furnished home, somebody may be looking at the portrait of an old gentleman named Arthur Pembroke. If you happen to see it, don't worry about the man in the chair. Look behind him. because Augustus Vale is standing in the darkness again, and this time he is holding